Good morning, everybody. My name's Sarah Jackson. I'm the Head of Business Services at SFHA, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar titled Risk Management, Not Just for a Crisis. Our hosts today are David and Noel from Decision Time, a software solution company that enables boards and senior leadership teams to make better informed decisions more quickly. David joined the team in 2008 as the technical director and is responsible for the design, development, and ongoing delivery of their suite of governance products. Noel joined in 2018, and as head of delivery, his focus is on driving excellence in the delivery of their products and services. This is the second webinar that Decision Time has produced for us, the first being on the topic of best practice for remote governance meetings. If you missed that, then it's still available to watch on the SFHA website, and Karen and Molly will put a link to that in the Q&A function of this webinar today. So before I pass over to Noel and David to start the session, just a few housekeeping points from me. The webinar is scheduled to last just under an hour, but if you need to leave at any time, a recording of today's sessions and also the slides will be available in the next couple of days. You won't have your audio enabled, but if you do want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function, which if you just sort of wiggle in front of your screen, you'll see it. It pops up in the control panel at the bottom. It's just two little speech bubbles. So feel free to ask questions throughout, and David and Noel will stop for questions if they see a few building, and if not, they'll pick them all up and answer them in the Q&A session at the end. And you'll also notice that your control panel has a chat function. So you can use this if you want to share any observations or thoughts with other attendees. And this gives us a huge degree of insight into other topics and ideas for future webinars. So that's everything from me. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session. And now over to David and Noel.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to briefly introduce ourselves, but Noel's going to do the first bit of introduction, and then we'll get into the slides that we're going to talk about today. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully this is useful and interesting. There's obviously a big appetite for talking about risk at the moment. We're not going to dwell too much on the current crisis. We're going to talk more about generally the benefits of risk, the way we see risk ourselves as an organization, and the way we approach it, and our tools, and the way we work with risk. So it won't be specifically about COVID. We'll try not to dwell on that too much, but we want to get into the sort of the details of risk management. I'm going to put my slides up here, and then I'll hand over to Noel to do the introductions. Okay, Noel, can you see the slides?
Yes, fine, David. So good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure for myself and David to get this opportunity to have this conversation with you this morning about risk management, not just for a crisis. Obviously, you've had the bios, and Sarah has kindly introduced us there. We will put our contact details on the next slide, just so that you have those details, and please feel free at any time after this webinar to get in touch with either of us. We're going to follow the agenda as you see on screen there, but hopefully with your input, we will delve in and out on a few conversation pieces. So we're going to talk about the principles of risk management. That's not us trying to re-educate you or educate you, but just talking about the principles of risk management as we apply them to the development of our software, and then talking about what the existing pain points are for our clients and for users in a risk environment, and looking at spreadsheets and Word documents, and trying then to look at how we can make something sophisticated without it being complicated. And risk is a process that you're trying to embed within your organization. And when I talk about my experience joining Decision Time, I've had a steep learning curve around risk management, and I've been fortunate in working with organizations like those in the attendees today, and with my own directors, to really understand how risk can be embedded in an organization. We'll finish up then with Q&A. Throughout the demonstration, I'll be keeping a close eye on the questions, and where we can, we will answer them in the context of the demonstration. So, as I say, just our contact details are there. Probably it's relevant just to say at this point for me, when we're talking about risk management, not just being for a crisis, and David might get slightly embarrassed at this stage, but we as an organization have a team, our board, so David and his two co-directors, and we do tend to practice what we preach. So in me seeing the slides that we're going to go through today, it's very much part of the culture that we feel we try to embed in our organization, and managing risk on an ongoing basis, and not just in a crisis, but again, I just have to say that we as an organization in this crisis, both how we as employees have experienced it and what we're doing for our customer base, I think that sort of is testament to what you'll hear here today. So without further ado, we'll move on through the slides.
Thanks, Noel. Every slide deck should start with a definition. It seems to be the way you do it. So I just want to make this, just to get up front, what the definition of risk is. This obviously comes straight from the ISO standard. The important bit for me in this is the last phrase. So the effect of uncertainty on an organization's ability to meet its objectives. So too often that last bit gets missed. So it's about the uncertainty and how we meet our objectives. And we're going to talk a bit more about the golden thread and a few other ideas in terms of linking risk right through your organization to your operational objectives. I'm going to just briefly talk about some of these principles. Now, as Noel said, these aren't the principles of risk management. There's lots of those floating around. These are 5 key things that we think are important, that we apply when we're doing risk management, and we think are key to a good risk management system. And the first one is to have it embedded. So many of you will be risk professionals within your organization, and there's often a feeling that risk is the responsibility of the risk manager. It's the responsibility of an individual or a team, that it's part of a small silo within an organization. And I think we all know that the best organizations dealing with risk are the ones where it's embedded throughout the organization. So it's on everyone's agenda. It's every leader, every manager, every department is thinking about risk management. And risk management becomes something that is just standard across all of your decision making. And we'll try and talk about that more as we go through different ways of doing that. One way of doing that is to free up the time of the risk managers and the people who are professionals in this area, and give them more chance to get out into the organization and actually do that, embed it, teach people, train people, get people understanding what risk is all about, and have it part of the entire organization structure. The second one is visibility. Again, there's a danger that risk becomes a spreadsheet which lives in a silo somewhere, and people only look at on a sort of ad hoc basis or once a quarter. You need risk to be visible. You need it to be something that people can see all the time, and they need to be able to understand what the state of risk is at any point in time. And that means you need a fairly real-time approach to risk, which again is often difficult to do, but is vital if you're really going to manage risk properly. You need to be able to see what your current state is. You need to know and understand what your risks are at any point in time. Ownership. This is something that we get into a lot of discussions and debates on sometimes with customers. I'm a very big fan of risks and controls being owned, and being owned by a specific named individual, and that's the individual who takes responsibility for that risk. So the sort of discussions we sometimes have, you'll pick up a risk register, and in the owner column, it'll list a department, or it'll list even maybe a job title. And that's getting closer to what we want, but I think in most cases you want to have a named individual. The other discussion we often get into is whether more than one person can own a risk. And Noel and I will occasionally go around in circles on this with customers, because in my view, if 2 people try and own something, nobody owns it. It can too easily fall between the cracks. And when we talk about this in terms of a system, usually what it comes down to is actually you need somebody who owns the risk and is responsible and named as the responsible person. And then you need some other people who can work on that risk. And that's fine. We have processes in our software for allowing editors and other rights, but we still have a single named person who owns the risk and is responsible for it. We think that helps with that sort of embedding that in the infrastructure of the organization. Risks need to be controlled, clearly. And to control them, you need multiple layers. We'll talk a bit later on about the 3 layers of defense and this idea of having not just one line of defense, but you need multiple. You need safety nets and you need other ways of catching when things go wrong. So risks need to be controlled, it needs to be multi-layered, and it needs to be proportional to the impact. Again, a danger that we get into as people who think about risk and as risk professionals is we can start to over-egg the pudding on some risks. So we end up in a situation where we're putting an awful lot of effort into a risk that may be not that serious, or if it were to materialize, is not going to have as much of an impact as we think. So we need to make sure that our controls are proportional. And to do that, we need to understand risk a lot better and understand where that will be. And the final one, which is currently hidden behind my window, I just need to move the Zoom controls out of the way, is monitored. So if you have your risks, you have them controlled, you have all of your controls and mitigations in place. If they're not being monitored, then they're not really being managed. And we all know this, as any sort of manager in an organization knows, that if you're not measuring something, if you're not keeping an eye on it, if you're not got a process for monitoring it, it's difficult to say that it's really being managed. So in our view, a good risk management system is one where there's regular monitoring, regular reviews, regular things and checkpoints to see that things are being done, they're not falling between the cracks, and we're not just assuming that our controls are in place. We have evidence and assurance for seeing that they are. I'll hand it back to Noel, who's going to talk a little bit about, many of our customers are coming from a basis where they're currently using spreadsheets. Some are using software solutions as well, but a lot of people are still using a spreadsheet for their risk register. So.
Yes, and even what we find is going back to that that piece about the complexity of enterprise risk management systems. We find that some organizations will maybe have been on a spreadsheet solution, moved then to a software solution, and inevitably then fall back into their own spreadsheet solution. And it's important when you are doing an embedding process that you really understand, what the actual key problems are. And the spreadsheet is a very good example of pulling together those problems. And if you're looking at this list of points on here and reflect it back to the previous slide where we're looking at the principles. So with a spreadsheet, it can be difficult to share with colleagues and multiple people be able to access the register. And invariably it becomes both a risk silo, a risk team responsibility, and the IT team. And you're not really getting it properly embedded across the organization. And the control is you're into version control, and the visibility then it's being able to access the documents, and it's very much a flat structured risk. So David mentioned there that ability of controlling the risk, and you'll find in spreadsheets and Word documents is very flat structure where you have the risk and you have your scoring and your controls and your additional actions. And it means then that you're looking at it very one-dimensional. And with an embedded layered system, you have that opportunity of making sure that it's real time. And ultimately then your reporting, overview and analysis, it just becomes part of what you do. That idea of we are what we continually do. We mentioned there, but we're here to talk about risk management, not just for a crisis. And whenever you make it something that's real time, as the next slide is going to, I suppose, introduce to you, you should be able to see that element of getting it embedded. So taken from the spreadsheet and the Word documents, you invariably end up with a profile over the year, like you're seeing in the top graph here, where there's a busting or a rushing around session at the end of a quarter, or in some organizations maybe at the end of a month, where 2 or 3 people are having to put a big press on the different members of staff in the different departments to get the risk register updated. And over time, and it's going to become more important when we're talking about the future of risk management, and on the back of the current pandemic, in auditing, and the regulation around what you're doing about managing your risks. And certainly, if you're able to present a profile like you're seeing at the bottom of this slide, where there is ongoing iterative risk monitoring control, and moved into all of the organization, and keeping that regular alignment with your strategic objectives, David mentioned at the outset in sort of the definition of risk. So the focus really is on embedding, making it visible, having it owned, and it being controlled and monitored on a straight line over time. So
one of the difficulties when you start to look at a system, and certainly a software solution, so part of my job is designing this software and helping to steer it in a certain direction. Anyone who's worked with any sort of software knows that you're constantly under pressure to add functionality. People will always want another button, another tool, something else for the software to do. And something we learn quite quickly when you develop any sort of a solution, and it could be software or a process or a procedure, is the more functionality you add, at some point the ease of use starts to drop off very rapidly. So one of the dangers that we've seen in the marketplace a bit is people talk about, well, yeah, okay, there's problems with a spreadsheet solution, there's problems with doing it in documents and Word documents. But when we went to a software solution, what we discovered was it was a huge beast that we had to feed all the time. It was a difficult, complicated bit of software. Everyone had to learn it. It was very time consuming. And suddenly we got this additional problem on our hands of complex software. And that's what we're trying to avoid as well. So whenever you're looking at, and this, again, across any sort of solution, if you're just putting a process in place, you have to choose the point at which you've added enough functionality, but not so much that it becomes difficult to use. Risk management in particular is one of these areas where if you make the solution too difficult, then people will find ways of not using it. They'll find ways around it. They'll find ways to not go in and keep it up to date. It's just human nature. If you make it a difficult thing to do, it will start to fall down and people just won't use it. So in the early stages of this graph, as we look at the sort of basic functionality, it's too simple. There's not enough value in there. So you need to get to a point where there's enough functionality and enough value, but not move into this end point where things are too complicated, it's too much effort, and nobody uses the solution. You're trying to hit that sweet spot in the middle with any sort of solution you're looking at. We had this conversation a couple of times recently with different organizations who are looking at risk management, and they're trying to find ways of getting risk management embedded in the organization, getting the information they need, but not over-egging it, not going too far in the other direction and making it a difficult thing to do. So it's a tricky balance to hit, but that's part of the problem of trying to get this in place. I'm going to move into a demo in a second. I just want to talk a bit more about this idea of multiple lines of defense. Any risk manager will know we often talk about these 3 lines of defense. Actually, it can be more than 3. It can be several layers. What you want to see is multiple layers. So for any risk, the first line of defense is going to be the actual operational things that you've got in place, the mitigations and the controls that you've got managing that risk on the ground. But we all know that it's very easy for those mitigations and controls to miss something, for them to be failing, for them not to be working. The example I often use, and it's because I come from an IT background and doing IT support for a period of time, is the idea of backups. So one of a significant risk for an organization is a loss of data. And that could be due to a failure. The likelihood of computer systems failing is extremely high. And if you're not careful, the impact of them failing can be extremely high too. So that can be a big risk. So the first thing that most people say is, right, well, our control is we do a nightly backup, a regular backup, and that's our control. So if the system fails, we've got these backup tapes and we can restore. So our impact has now gone dramatically down. And in the worst cases, that's where it's left. So the spreadsheet lists that as a control and we all move on, satisfied that it's working. Until the day that the server actually crashes or bursts into flames or there's a flood in the server room. And you go to restore the backups and discover that actually that there's nothing on the tape, or the tape failed in the last 3 nights, or the person who normally does the backups actually has been sick for the past fortnights. They haven't been doing it. So you need, as well as those operational controls of having those backups in place, you need a layer of oversight. So that is the IT manager getting a weekly report that says that these backups have definitely been done, that the IT manager is checking some of those, that someone else is checking those backups. And you've got a layer on top of the actual operational control of management oversight. And then on top of that, you want an internal audit process, because those two structures could fail too. Those layers could fail. So you want an external assurance, and that's an audit, an internal and external auditor walking into the room and saying, right, prove this to me. Show me a backup being restored. Show me where that is on a tape. I'll pick something at random. You tell me whether you can restore it or not. And that's the only sort of surefire way of making sure that you've got all those controls in place. Now, obviously, for some risks, you need all of those and you need multiple controls in each of those layers. For some risks, the impact is low enough that you don't need as much. You can manage that risk and not be too concerned. If the impact isn't that big, if the likelihood isn't that big, you may be able to manage with much less. And that goes back to the proportionality. But you do want to be ensuring that you've got those multiple layers. And again, if your risk structure is very flat, it's difficult to show those multiple layers. It's difficult to know that you've got more than one layer. You can just see a list of controls. You don't know exactly what all those controls are, what type of control they are. I'm going to jump into a quick demonstration here of the product. And I'm just going to use this as a way of demonstrating some of those things we've talked about. Obviously, we think we've built those principles and those things into this. There's probably systems and gaps in there that you might see in terms of your own risk register and different things you might want to try and achieve. But this is to give you an overview and an idea of what it can do. So if I go into our risk tool and I'll go into a sample risk register, we've got one set up that's generally housing related. And I'm going to show here just that idea of visibility. So our first principle was about visibility. So get that idea of having a visible overview of your risks and of your status at any point in time. So in this case, we've got a dashboard view, which is showing our standard sets of heat maps. There's a lot of talk at the moment going on amongst risk managers about how heat maps maybe are not the way to do it. There's people who vehemently hate them. And there are people who are vehemently defending them. There are other ways of showing risk, but a heat map is quite a useful way of showing where you are in a risk process. So in this case, we're showing the inherent heat map. We're seeing sort of most of our risks are up in this red and amber section. In our residual, they've moved down more into the yellow and the green, and our target is to move even more of them down into the green. In our demo, we can see there is one stubborn risk, which is starting off at a 5.5. We've managed to move to a 4.5, but our target is that it'll stay there. And we'll all have some risks like that, where whatever we do, there's very little we can do to mitigate them. And we may have to just have ways of accepting them or mitigating them, or we may be in a process of transferring those risks. So we see at a quick glance what our progress is looking like at the moment. We also see at a quick glance where our risks are sitting in our residual at the moment. For our controls and our actions, again, just a simple overview. Going back to that idea of balancing simplicity with functionality, you can have quite a detailed review of a control and lots of quantitative and qualitative information about how that control is doing. But there's something to be said for having a fairly simple RAG status, which people understand, where when they review the control, they say, is it red, is it amber, is it green? We all get that. We all know roughly what that means. You know, red means it's failing, amber means we've got some concerns, green means everything's good. That gives you at least a simple and a quick way of people analyzing and defining those, and then that can bubble up to the top in terms of a view like this. Where it starts to get interesting is you look at this sort of dashboard, and if I was an auditor coming into the organization, this dummy organization here, I would be saying this residual heat map is not really where your risks are at the moment. The inherent one is, because most of your controls have been flagged as amber or red. You know, out of all of your controls, there's 10 ambers, 1 red. There's only 3 of them that are sitting in green. That would suggest that everyone who's reviewed these controls is saying there's problems going on. Well, that would also suggest that in general, this is the state of your risk at the moment, because most of your controls are failing. We're looking at sort of, again, simpler ways of maybe doing that on a risk by risk basis. So for an individual risk, you might have controls and know exactly what impact they have on the impact and likelihood of the risk. So you might be able to say that if a risk fails, we can actually adjust the score automatically. Again, that's an element of, is it worth the complexity of that functionality to get something useful out of it? It may be, or it may not be. It may just make it extra complicated. So we're looking at different ways of trying to handle that, you know, give you an overview, let the risk manager do their job of managing risk, let the leaders in the organization see what's happening, but without over-complicating it. In a similar way, the sort of 1 to 5 and 1 to 5 on likelihood and impact is a nice, straightforward, simple way that everyone tends to get fairly quickly. So, you then get a list underneath of all of the different sort of risks that are in place. This, and in our system, this dashboard is a filter. So if I want to see what that one risk is, I can click on it and show what's happening down below. If I want to see the 3 risks that are down in the bottom corner, I can see those. If I want to see the 10 controls that are amber, I can see a quick list of all the controls, and specifically those 10 amber ones, or what's the red control. I can see that control and I can go and see which risk it's associated with. So from this front screen, any leader in the organization can fairly quickly find their way around it, work out what's going on at the moment and drill in. What that's replacing in some organizations is, and I've sat through a few of these, and I'm sure you have too, where you get a risk and audit committee meeting or a board meeting where an A3 spreadsheet is produced with lines and lines of information on it, and we go through those lines one at a time and talk about what the progress has been on each risk. That may be a useful backstop if you've got the time and the energy to do it, but in a lot of organizations that just means that by the last few risks everyone's beginning to lose interest a little bit and beginning to lose energy. Whereas on a view like this, we can quite quickly see what we need to look at. So we can look at the risks that are in our highest sections. We can work our way through those first and make sure that we've covered those off. We can see which ones have got controls that are failing or actions that are not being completed on time and are going overdue. We can drill into those ones first. And we don't spend a lot of time on the risks that are down this bottom left-hand corner, or that all the controls are in green and everything else seems to be going fine. We may want to come back and just review those as well. They don't get left behind, but we don't need to spend a lot of effort and time on them in some of the other meetings. Similarly, down at the bottom here, if I show all again, we've got a couple of different views in this system. Here I'm showing the last updated date for any risk. So again, I might want to filter that and show by time and go back to some of the ones that haven't been updated for a long time. Equally, we've got a movement column you can have here as well, which shows you which risks have moved recently. So if you've got a risk that's moved downwards, as in it's got, moved up and right, but the score has got worse, then you can go in and drill into those ones in a bit more detail. Those are the ones you want to be particularly concerned about. You can also use the filters to go into specific departments. You can go into different schemes. But the other important thing down here, again, for visibility, is this idea of looking for specifically the things that are overdue, but also the things that have been escalated. So again, you want a built-in process in your risk management where you are escalating risk, where you're taking risks that are operational by nature, but have got a serious concern over them, a problem. They've now got a bigger impact than they used to have. Escalate those, and the board or the senior management team need to start looking at those in more detail. So you can flag them that way as well. So there's lots of different ways of filtering and seeing this information in a much more active way than a static spreadsheet, and a much more layered way as well. On an individual risk itself, you see the same sort of details. You've got lots of information at the top here about the risk. We actually, a nice tip that some of you may already know about, but rather than just having a risk description like this, we've got a lot of setups where the risk description is split into 3 boxes. They're labeled, there is a risk of, it is due to, it results in. So that's a nice way to think about risk and to separate out your thinking about the risk description. You've got various categories of risk. You've got all your, as I said before, your ownership. You can pick a specific owner. In this case, you can only pick one owner at a time. You can, if I go back here, you can choose as many editors though as you like. So you can have multiple people who work on the risk, who manage it, who do various things with it, but this person is still recognized as the owner of the risk. You've got all your different filters. Most people won't have as many filters as this, but you might have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these. But you can filter your risk in lots of different ways. List out your implications. And then you get into scoring. And again, scoring, this is where we try and add the simplicity back into the process. If you're using a spreadsheet at the moment, quite often what you'll have is a column where you put a number from 1 to 5, and a column next to it where you put another number from 1 to 5. That's great, that can work, but you've got to understand what 1 to 5 is. And you might have another document somewhere which explains it, but here we're actually putting the descriptions next to the numbers. So if you want to know what 3 is, it's possible, the event might occur at some time, so on. 5 is almost certain, 1 is rare. So you get a bit more, you take some of the subjectivity out, a bit more objectivity in how you choose these. Similarly on the impacts, so there's descriptors here. You'll notice these descriptors are talking about minor or personal injury and fatalities. That's because up here we chose this risk to be, where's the category, health and safety. If I change that instead to make it a financial risk, then now all my scorings will talk about things like minimal financial loss, less than 100K up to above 10 million. So, and again, these descriptors are all completely customizable to whatever organization you're in, because for some organization, the 10 million might be an insignificant loss. I can't think of many, but you never know. So all of these things can be managed to just mean that anyone then, it doesn't have to be a risk expert, any manager should be able to look at this and score their risk accordingly and decide what it should be. Put your controls in place, and for each control, you put in the multi-layers up here by choosing, is this an operational control, corporate oversight, an internal audit, or an external audit? So those are basically our 3 layers, with those top 2 being one or other of those layers, but we can add an extra one. You can say whether the control specifically affects likelihood or impact. Again, something that gets missed often on a spreadsheet. We look at a lot of people's risk registers, and we often see risks where all of the controls seem to be dealing with likelihood, but the residual score seems to have been changed mostly in impact. So there's clearly some gap in the thinking there going on. This way, if you say specifically what each control is affecting, whether it's affecting likelihood or impact, you'll get a feel for how your score should change a bit further down. Details of the control, again, an owner, talking about ownership, specific owner for this control, when it was last reviewed, what the details of the last review are, and when it's going to next be reviewed, and then its current status. So when I come in to review this, I'll get a reminder to tell me that this is due on a specific date. So I'll do the review on the 3rd. I put in the details of what my findings are when I reviewed it, and I set the current status as the most important thing. So if I set that to red now, and I say we need to review it again at the end of this month, then I'll get a reminder again at the end of the month to do that. The system lets you add documents, Word documents, spreadsheets, evidence, photos, whatever you want to add in there, just to keep the information and the assurance up to date on this particular control. Another set of scoring for residual scores. Then we get a set of actions. And again, going back to the top of here, we're very keen on this idea of the three heat maps. Not everyone does this, and you don't have to. You can switch one or any of them off. And we actually have a few customers now who've moved even to 4 heat maps. Again, I go back to that, trying to keep the complexity down, but you can have an inherent score, a residual score, and then we like this idea of having a target. So if you're not tolerating the risk at this point, you've got a plan to move it to further on, then you put some actions in and have a target for where you think you can get it to in terms of its likelihood and impact. And those actions go in as simple sort of to-dos, put the detail against them, give them an owner, give them a due date and so on, and you can set that up. So again, that's where this idea of ownership, of constant monitoring comes in, of assurance, of making sure that things are actually controlled. At any point, you can mark this action as complete. When you mark it as complete, you'd normally turn it maybe into a control, but not always. Some of these actions, so some actions will be about moving the risk on and controlling it better. Some actions might even be about fixing the failures up here. So here we've got one of these controls, redundancy arrangements in place for key vendors. We've marked it as red, there's serious concern about it. I might well add an action down here which deals with that. So these don't have to just be about getting towards our target. They can also be about fixing our existing problems. We get a target score and then a set of review notes. And again, that idea, one of our main principles of making sure everything is being reviewed and monitored. You set up a process where you say, I'm going to come in here, and at different types of review. So somebody might be coming to review the controls, someone else might be doing an action, someone could be doing an internal audit or an audit and compliance committee meeting or board approval. So there's lots of different ways you can add in these sorts of notes, choose the type of note, type the note in and give a date when you're going to do it again. And that way you keep this constant cycle going on. Equally though, you're also making decisions when you're choosing when to next review it. Now you need some oversight of this. You need to be making sure that people aren't always saying, right, well, I've reviewed it today. I'm actually going to review it again in 3 years' time. And that's my next review date. You'll need some way of stopping that. But in general, you also don't necessarily want to make everyone review everything every single month, because some of these risks are going to be quite low down. And you may be happy enough that the risk is reviewed every 6 months at that point, because its controls are under control and you've got a low impact or a low likelihood. So you're not forcing things on people in terms of when they have to review them, but you're giving them the opportunity to set up their next review at this point. Everything is maintained in an audit log. You need that visibility too. Talking about visibility, you need to see that. You need to be able to go in and see what's changed and what's been updated and so on. So that's a fairly quick sort of overview of what a risk system can look like. As I say, there are more complex systems out there. There are simpler systems out there. And part of the decision making that everyone goes through is trying to decide for our individual risk register what makes sense, for our level of risk, for the way we currently manage what makes sense. But I go back to a few of those original principles. You want to make sure, in fact, I will jump back into this and go back over a couple of these. You want to make sure that you can embed risk management within the organization. That means as many people having access at any time as possible. You don't want it to be funneled through one risk manager if you can avoid that. You want people to be able to update their own actions, their own controls, mark their own reviews, and even add their own risks and have that embedded in the process. You want it to be as visible and as clear and as visual as possible. So make it nice and simple for people to understand where things are, what the problems are, and all of that. You want to make sure that you've got a clear definition of ownership throughout the system. And you've seen there, we have owners built into individual risks and owners of every individual control and owners of every individual action. The owners of the control may be different from the owner of the risk. That makes sense. The owners of the control are more likely to be operational. The owner of the risk could well be a senior manager. You want everything to be controlled. You want to know that you've got your 3 levels of defense and if possible, multiple levels of defense. You want to see that coverage. So you want to look at a risk and say, have we got operational controls? Have we got management oversight? Have we got external and internal audit? And you want the whole thing to be monitored in a process of ongoing monitoring. And again, not that sort of simple ongoing monitoring, but as many of those as possible. We're going to talk a little bit about the future. The future risk management is an interesting one. The main thing we're seeing at the moment in terms of what's changing right now is complexity is changing. It's increasing for everybody. The complexity of our operational environments and those external forces is always getting higher. So for most of your organizations, you'll be seeing this. You'll know that the technology can add complexity, that as you grow, you add complexity, that lots of different things from the external environment add complexity. If you then throw into the mix, and I said we're not focusing on this, but you throw into the mix a global pandemic, you're going to throw into the mix soon. We don't even know what the economic impact is going to be yet, not properly. We're going to find that out soon. We're going to throw that into the mix. We're going to throw lots of other external forces into the mix. All of our businesses and all our organizations are getting more complex. Visibility has increased. So it used to be in the past that issues and problems might go unnoticed by our customers, by our public. Just doesn't happen anymore. With social media, with the sort of spread of online information, websites, news, all of these things mean that if there are issues, if there are problems, the visibility of that is immediate and instant. So that rapid dissemination of information is a huge part of our risk management process. And then scrutiny is increasing. So for all of our organizations, particularly in a regulated sector like housing, you've got increased regulation, increased oversight, and the range of different people are looking at the organization and wanting to have assurance that you're covering your risks and you're doing all the things you're supposed to do. So the future for every organization is increased complexity, increased visibility, and increased scrutiny. And all of that feeds into all of your governance, not just risk, but risk is going to be a big part of that. Some of the things we're starting to look at in terms of how to handle that and how to manage that better in the future. Many of you will have heard of this idea of the golden thread, sometimes the silver thread. There's lots of different ways of talking about it. But the definition of risk that we started with today was the effect of uncertainty on an organization's ability to meet objectives. So that meeting of objectives is key and critical. Another way of mapping risk and another way of thinking about risk is looking at the path between where we are now to where we want to be, and risk are the things that are going to move us off that path. So having that connection between your risks and your actual purpose and strategic objectives is critical. The way many organizations do it is to have a clearly defined list of strategic objectives, high-level objectives and goals, and have those linked very directly to risk. So if you've got a risk and you can't imagine how it links to one of your strategic objectives, it's probably you're either missing something or it's probably not really a risk for your organization. They should all be in some way associated with that. So if we set up a golden thread through everything you do, define your vision and purpose, have your strategic objectives in place and your operational objectives, and then map those to your risks and opportunities, and also set out your action plans and your operational action plans. And then that individual performance objectives and plans come out of that. And then you go through a loop of measuring and evaluating that performance. You'll get a really well embedded process. We're looking at this not just for risk. This also applies to our goals and performance management tools, and also applies to our meetings tools. So if you can get as an organization everything you do linking back to your vision, your strategic objectives and your team objectives, that's a really solid place to be. It gives you a clear indication of how you get on. Another thing that a lot of people are talking about, and this isn't new as in it's only just come out. This is something people have been talking about for a while, but most organizations are not doing it. We've seen a few of our customers start to move towards this direction, and a few of them are doing it in a lot of detail. Most people are just thinking about it. And this is the idea that risk shouldn't just be about the negatives. Risk shouldn't just be about threats, and we almost always go straight to threats when we talk about risk. Our initial thought is about threats, things that could go wrong. And maybe we're naturally pessimistic, but that's the way we tend to think. So if you get everyone into a room to talk about risk, they'll almost automatically start talking about fire and flood and disease and pandemic and losing staff and all of the negative things that could happen to the organization. But best practice in risk management is about talking about opportunities too. And if you try and map the way we talk about threats and the way we talk about opportunities, you'll see that most of the things are the same. They just have a slightly different name or a slightly different direction we're taking them in. So for a threat, you're trying to minimize the likelihood and or minimize the impact. For opportunities, though, we're trying to maximize the likelihood and maximize the impact. So for an opportunity, our controls are the ways we're going to take advantage of that opportunity if it occurs. So rather than thinking about how we mitigate the risk, how do we take advantage of a particular opportunity? So us as an organization, a new market might open up for us, or a new technology might come along. We need to be prepared for that. We need to have controls and mitigations in place which let us take advantage of that opportunity when it comes along and maximize the likelihood of it happening and maximize the impact when it does. On the threat side, where we talk about avoiding risk, transferring risk, mitigating risk, we often talk about that idea of tolerate, transfer, terminate, all of those sorts of ideas. You've got a similar approach to opportunities. So instead of avoiding risk, you're trying to embrace opportunities. Instead of transferring it, you're actually trying to share it. So looking at ways in which you can take an opportunity and find other people to share that opportunity with to maximize your own ability to take advantage of it and the impact. And whereas in threats, we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about trying to mitigate the effect of a threat. In opportunities, we're trying to enhance the impact of the threat, of the risk. So if it's an opportune risk, if it's an opportunity that's coming along, we want to find ways in which we can enhance that opportunity. And just finally, the last slide here is about embedding risk management. So again, most of us, our vision is to see an organization where risk management is thoroughly embedded throughout the organization. It isn't just a silo, it's not a department, it's not the responsibility of one individual or a small team. It's not something that just lives in one spreadsheet and we get out and dust off every quarter or every couple of months. It's something that's part of the organization as a whole. It's on everyone's agenda. It's something everyone's thinking about. And there's some advice there about how you do that. How do you embed it in the organization? Well, one way is you recognize that actually there's a lot of risk management going on outside of your standard risk management processes. Actually, when you talk to managers and leaders in the organization, they're all doing risk management of some sort. They might not have recognized it as risk management. So identify it, find it, and start talking about it as risk management so that people see that it's already there. Then go after as many opportunities as you can for your risk experts, people like you, I'm assuming, who are watching this, that you can go out and find ways of improving the risk management that's already happening and improving the evidence of the operation and showing its effectiveness. So find areas where risk management is already occurring, find ways of improving it, but also find ways of proving how it's given a benefit to the organization. So, and one way of doing that, or one of the things that hampers that from happening, is having to wrangle spreadsheets and difficult systems and processes and having to be the only person who can update the board on risk management and has to produce all these reports. Risk experts become bogged down in that sort of stationary and organizational approach, all of the administration around risk. You get bogged down in that and you're not able to actually go out and champion risk to show where it's giving a benefit and show where it's helping performance. So overall, the aim of that is to move away from risk management being a chore, an external requirement, and make it what people talk about, a genuine tool for excellence. So get your organization to a place where you can do that. Okay, I think I've talked enough. I'm going to switch over to Q&A. I don't see any questions coming in. Everyone's being very quiet at the moment. Does anyone have any questions for us? You can either put them into the chat or go to the Q&A section and put them in there.
I think that was great, David and Noah. Oh, there's a question coming in now, I think.
It's coming up in chat, I think, yeah.
From Zan. So Zan's saying, I can see how this could also apply to equalities as discrimination is a risk, example, equality impact assessments.
Very much so, yeah, yeah. So there are very specific areas, and this is where, you know, a good tool will let you manage any any sort of risk. A good process, a good mindset will let you manage any sort of risk, but certainly that is something. I didn't put it on the slide about the change in the environment at the moment, but another part of that is increasing social awareness, increasing requirement for organizations to have those social policies in place and to be really demonstrating that they've got equality, that they've got environmental impact statements, they've got all those things in place. All of those things are covered by the same visibility control methodology. So,
yeah. I think something that struck me recently when approaching our risk is just if anybody had a global pandemic on their risk register, I think they deserve a gold star, because it has thrown everything into a state of flux, and it just shows you can be as prepared as you possibly you think you are, and then something comes left field and has such an impact on the risk register. And I love that little cartoon that you had around just putting all your problems onto a spreadsheet, and I think we can all relate to that you just have this big cumbersome spreadsheet that management is key to, because it can just sit in a drive and nobody really looks at it, but you think you've done your part because you've got this big complicated Excel spreadsheet. And yes, I think we all feel the pain about sharing it at board and nobody can read it and the font's too small and you need to print it out and the paper's not big enough. And yeah, so this seems a really good, sensible, practical solution to have everything in one place. And I think the future is certainly moving off of Excel.
Yeah, I would like to see that. There's a question come up in Q&A, but I can't open the Q&A.
So this one says, sorry, David, this one is RSLs differ a lot in scale, but the inherent risks are shared. What about resourcing? Have you come across the scale issue?
Sorry, read that one to just the first section of that again for me.
So, so housing associations differ a lot in scale, but the inherent risks are shared. Yeah.
So scaling these sorts of things is complex and difficult. One of the dangers you hit often is just ending up with, if you get everyone into a room and decide to start trying to think of all your risks, you will come up with an awful lot of them. And you need to start focusing on just the ones that are critical. I actually think most housing associations could share a set of risks. And I think there are some organizations out there that are doing this, giving you, here are a fairly standard set of risks. But the trick to scaling these sorts of processes is just to, and that's where the risk professional comes in, is to manage that process, is to look at where there are shared risks and make sure they're in there once and shared amongst the right people. And we can do some things in the system of linking risks together, of trying to tag them in certain ways so you can join them together so you don't have that ballooning effect of lots of different risks being added. Hopefully that helps a little bit. The only other thing I can say is at the moment, so our system is used by some fairly small organizations who might have 10 risks on their risk register and just use it for their board level, up to our biggest customers, HM Land Registry, who have, I'm not sure what the number is, but it's thousands of risks in their risk register and hundreds of people managing them to manage trillions of pounds worth of property asset risk. So it can scale, but it is a tricky thing to do. And one of the jobs of us as the people who are thinking about risk is to keep on top of it and to make sure it doesn't balloon, because otherwise, again, you end up with that complexity that you just don't want.
Yes, just to add at that point, some organizations are coming to us with maybe a spreadsheet with hundreds of risks, and one of the benefits that they see is, they're able to scale the responsibility while consolidating the risks. And I think that is key to it, that you actually can, create these larger risks that are more project based and linked to your strategic objectives, and scale using the controls and actions. And it was back to that idea of a very flat structure currently, where with the system you can have your risks and it's your controls and your mitigations that become where you have your scale at.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that was great, David and Noel. Thank you very much for that. If you would like to connect with the team at Decision Time directly, their contact details will be made available along with a recording of today's session and the slides on the SFHA website in the next couple of days. For those of you who haven't seen it, we've published a briefing document titled Practical Governance Advice. It's authored by our colleague Alan Stokes, and it covers a range of advice on topics including governing body meetings, legal and regulatory obligations, as well as business continuity update templates. So it's on our dedicated COVID-19 webpage under the briefing section. And the SFHA webinar schedule is on our What's On page of the website, and we're adding new dates every day, so please do check that out. Thanks again to David and Noel for hosting the session today. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you to another webinar soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.